What if the world looked very different? Not just politically, but geologically. Imagine looking at a map where all the continents are jammed together, where the Atlantic Ocean doesn't exist, and the Pacific is a yawning mouth on the planet's far side. This isn't science fiction, it's a peek into Earth's ancient past. Over 200 million years ago, Earth's land masses were fused together into a single supercontinent known as Pangea. But what if, in a twist of fate, the tectonic forces beneath Earth's crust never tore it apart? What if Pangea remained a single continent, vast and united? Today, we explore the profound consequences this would have on everything, from evolution and climate to human history, geopolitics, and the modern world. Let's start with the basics. Pangea was formed during the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras, around 335 million years ago, and began to rift around 175 million years ago. That rifting gave rise to the world we know today, the familiar outlines of Africa, the Americas, Eurasia, and Australia drifting apart over eons. But the movement of tectonic plates is driven by forces within the Earth's mantle, massive, slow-moving convection currents that push and pull the plates like puzzle pieces. In our alternate timeline, these currents have weakened or stabilized. Perhaps the mantle cooled more quickly than in our history, or some unknown geophysical quirk prevented the plates from moving apart. The result? Pangea remains intact, unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Now, the first and most immediate consequence would be on Earth's climate. Our planet's weather patterns are intricately tied to the distribution of continents and oceans. In a world dominated by one massive landmass, ocean currents would flow very differently. The supercontinent would likely create extreme climates, arid, desert-like interiors far from the moistening influence of the sea, and lush, wet coastal regions dominated by monsoons. Without the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf Stream, one of the main drivers of temperate climate in Western Europe and the eastern United States, wouldn't exist. Much of what we know as Europe might be cold and desolate, while central Pangea could be a vast Sahara-like expanse, subject to dramatic seasonal swings between scorching heat and bitter cold. Rainforests, like the Amazon and Congo, would be unlikely to form. The equatorial band across central Pangea might instead be dominated by seasonal savannas or scrublands, due to the lack of consistent rainfall. The biodiversity hotspots we know today, rich ecosystems shaped by millennia of climatic isolation, would be radically different. Species would evolve together, not apart, and this has major implications for life on Earth. In our real history, continental drift created isolated evolutionary laboratories. Australia gave rise to marsupials like kangaroos and koalas. Madagascar nurtured lemurs. South America evolved its own set of unique animals, giant sloths, jaguars, capybaras. Isolation creates difference. But in a unified Pangea, life forms would share the same contiguous landmass, competing and evolving side by side. Predators and prey would spread across the supercontinent. The evolutionary arms race would be relentless, with fewer safe havens and more dominant species prevailing over vast territories. The result? A more homogenized biosphere, fewer, but more competitive species. Possibly, fewer extinctions from sudden invasive species, but also, less diversity overall. Dinosaurs, for instance, might have lasted longer in a Pangea world. In our timeline, their extinction was hastened by a combination of volcanic activity, an asteroid impact, and isolated continents unable to buffer against climate catastrophe. But in a world where ecosystems were more connected, it's possible that species could have migrated away from danger zones, preserving pockets of life that might otherwise be lost. Conversely, disease and invasive species could spread unchecked, devastating large regions quickly. Let's jump ahead. Say evolution still eventually leads to primates, and primates to humans. Where would humanity have emerged? In our world, modern Homo sapiens arose in East Africa, but this was in part due to the particular environment that region provided. In a Pangean world, the equivalent zone might be drier, more landlocked, or otherwise less conducive to our ancestors. It's entirely plausible that humans, or human-like species, could evolve elsewhere, perhaps in coastal lowlands of Pangea's western shores, or even in highlands created by massive mountain ranges formed by tectonic compression. But the key is this: wherever humanity evolved, it would do so in a much more interconnected environment. Without oceans to divide us, early humans would have migrated across the supercontinent far more easily. This could lead to a very different demographic history. No isolation meant no Native American culture separate from Eurasian or African ones. No Polynesian navigators. No Inca, no Maori. Humanity might still be divided into linguistic and cultural groups, but all of them would be shaped by a continuous exchange of ideas, technologies, and diseases. This would have enormous implications for development. The so-called Columbian exchange of crops, animals, and microbes after 1492 would be unnecessary. It would have happened thousands of years earlier. Wheat, horses, and iron tools would have reached every corner of Pangea long before recorded history. Agriculture would spread quickly, leading to the rapid rise of civilizations. There would be no old world and new world dichotomy, just one world. That sounds utopian, but the consequences could be dystopian, too. Diseases like smallpox, once unleashed, would tear through early populations without natural oceanic barriers to slow their spread. Civilizations would rise faster, but also clash sooner. Warfare could become global centuries ahead of schedule. The first empires might stretch across hundreds or thousands of miles, shaped not by seafaring prowess but by control of inland rivers and trade routes that span the continental interior. Massive overland trade networks, perhaps akin to a supercharged Silk Road, would dominate. Wool-based transport would be king. Camels, horses, and oxen might have even greater prominence than they did in our world. Religious and philosophical traditions, too, would be transformed. Imagine if the spiritual ideas that emerged in Mesopotamia, India, and China had all developed side by side, with constant mutual influence. Instead of distinct religious traditions evolving in isolation, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we might see the early birth of syncretic mega-religions, born from cultural fusion rather than separation. There might be fewer total belief systems, but those that exist would be massive and geographically dominant, perhaps enforced by powerful empires that spanned huge stretches of the supercontinent. Geopolitics in the Pangea world would be unlike anything we've known. Modern political borders were shaped by geography, mountains, rivers, oceans. In Pangea, geography would still matter, but in a different way. Instead of distinct continental powers, you might have massive regional blocks vying for dominance. Maybe the northwestern quadrant of Pangea is dominated by a vast confederation of highland city-states. Maybe the southern coast is home to sprawling lowland empires rich in agriculture and trade. Conflict between these groups would be frequent and devastating. But diplomacy, too, would flourish. Think of a world where the United Nations was formed 1,000 years earlier, simply because proximity demanded it. Technology would evolve faster. Writing, metallurgy, and mathematics would spread quickly. There's no doubt that humanity would reach the Industrial Revolution far earlier. With more unified trade, fewer isolated backwaters, and constant competition between large, adjacent civilizations, innovation would be the currency of survival. Steam power, electricity, and possibly even computers could emerge centuries ahead of schedule. But this rapid advancement would come at a price. Environmental degradation might begin earlier, too. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, and mass extinctions would be harder to avoid when every part of the supercontinent is densely populated. Resources would be consumed faster. Climate change might begin in antiquity, not modernity. And without the oceans acting as barriers, pollution could spread more quickly, affecting larger swaths of the biosphere. A coal-fueled Pangea might be far deadlier to Earth's atmosphere than our fractured continents ever were. Let's consider infrastructure. In a world without large oceans separating landmasses, there would be no need for long-distance seafaring. Instead, we'd see the rise of colossal overland networks, railroads stretching thousands of miles, roadways connecting continents. The Trans-Pangean Railway might be the equivalent of our Trans-Siberian Railway, but 10 times as extensive. Inland canals might be used to transport goods, linking the few inland seas and rivers that exist. Air travel would still develop, but likely later, since most travel needs could be met on land. Maritime trade would be diminished, replaced by fleets of caravans and convoys crisscrossing the interior of the supercontinent. What about nations today? Would the United States exist? Would China? Likely not, at least not in the form we recognize. The political map would be redrawn entirely. The United States as a nation was shaped by Atlantic crossings, colonialism, and separation from Europe. In a Pangea world, those forces wouldn't exist in the same way. You might still have dominant powers, perhaps something akin to China, perhaps a powerful polity in the equivalent of West Africa, or a mountainous realm in what might resemble Eastern Europe, but these powers would form from landlocked expansion, not seaborne empires. Global conflicts would take on an entirely different character. Without oceans as buffers, wars would spread quickly. World war equivalents could break out in the Bronze Age. Massive land battles, sieges, and mobile cavalry warfare might dominate military history. The invention of gunpowder would be a turning point, not just for warfare, but for geopolitics. Whoever controlled its production would hold sway over vast regions. Nuclear weapons, when they inevitably arose, could be even more dangerous. In a world where everyone is your neighbor, deterrence might be the only hope for peace. Let's zoom out. How would our culture be different? Art, literature, and music evolve in response to environment and isolation. In a unified landmass, cultural differences might be subtler. Languages would still diversify, but massive lingua francas would dominate. Maybe one or two dominant languages emerge, spoken across half of Pangea, with regional dialects. Cultural fusion would be constant, no sushi without rice cultivation in one region and seafood in another, no blues music without centuries of intertwined musical traditions. In a unified world, racism might manifest differently. The geographic separations that led to different skin tones and physical adaptations would still exist, but proximity would blur them. You might see more blending of physical traits across populations, leading to a more homogenized human appearance over time. Or, inversely, regional identities might harden due to close competition. Nationalism might be more pronounced, fueled by the need to distinguish us from them in a world without oceans to do it for us. As we approach the modern era in this alternate timeline, the shape of the 21st century comes into view. Climate change would be a massive issue, perhaps even more urgent than in our timeline. With one giant landmass, temperature extremes would intensify. Deserts would sprawl across the central parts of Pangea. Coastal flooding might affect fewer people, but droughts, heat waves, and inland flooding would be catastrophic. Megacities could stretch uninterrupted for thousands of kilometers. Urban planning would be a global concern. The question of governance, how to rule a supercontinent, would dominate political discourse. Would there be a global government? Maybe. Or maybe endless federations, loose alliances, and regional pacts. The European Union might be mirrored in several massive continental unions, each struggling to balance autonomy with cooperation. The Internet, when it arises, could connect everyone on Earth without the latency caused by undersea cables. Cyber warfare might be the defining threat of the era, one continent, one digital battlefield. And finally, space. Would a Pangea-based civilization reach the stars? Almost certainly. In fact, faster technological development might mean we're already there. With earlier cooperation, or at least proximity-driven necessity, humanity might have landed on the Moon in the 1800s, and Mars by the late 20th century. A united planet, born from a shared landmass, might think of itself as one people far earlier than we did. Or perhaps it would remain eternally divided, locked in rivalry even as it reached into the void. In the end, the story of Pangea is a story of what might have been, and what still could be. Because even if our continents drifted apart, our destinies remain intertwined. One world, many histories.